Okay, so in this talk, we're going to be discussing a second explanation for why wars occur, which is called the commitment problem. So this explanation has three subparts to it that we'll talk about. It's not completely inconsistent with the information-based explanation of war, but it is an alternative rationalist explanation. It was talked about in Jim Fearon's piece that you're supposed to read for today, but it also has been cited quite extensively with regard to change. And it was an explanation that became more popularized with Bob Powell's publication of a paper called War is a Commitment Problem in 2006. But the thinking in this area existed in political science, but also interestingly, the logic of it existed in many historical explanations of war and in several policy explanations of war. The heart of the commitment problem focuses on change, which is this idea that although war may be inefficient, it may be more efficient to strike a deal today, but if we look at this deal over time, we may get to a point where the deal itself is unsustainable and therefore not credible, meaning that two sides, or at least one side in negotiation, cannot credibly commit to the terms of a negotiated settlement, and at some point will abrogate it. And if they abrogate it later, in a sense, it may be advantageous for the other party to engage in conflict right away. Now, the thing you can think about as we go through today is the United States and Iran, because this is something that comes up over and over again in policy discussions, which is if Iran is allowed to develop any form of nuclear capability in the future, when it gets that capability, it will use that power to exert more influence over the Middle East or undermine U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Even President Obama, prior to the Trump administration, said that the acquisition of a nuclear weapon by Iran was a game changer. The idea is that once Iran has that weapon, their power rapidly increases and their ability to accept the status quo that existed before is no longer possible, right? Just given their new power, they have to get a negotiated settlement that reflects that power. So keep that in mind as we go through today. Now, bear in mind also, your papers focus on the commitment problem as one explanation for why conflict may emerge between the United States and other countries, and how COVID might affect capabilities. So this is something to pay attention to. Again, this is the explanation I think is more persuasive than the information-based explanation, and I'll explain to you why. So again, this is sort of the where most political science studies have sort of gravitated towards in understanding rationalist explanations for war. So with that, let's get to the slides. Again, we're going to be discussing the commitment problem as discussed, which is the argument that although parties may be able to agree to a deal in the present day, in the future, change will occur, which will make the deal that the parties agreed to today non-sustainable, and one side will not be able to rationally commit themselves to the terms of the deal that they originally agreed to. So let's think about, first of all, why we need this explanation, why the information-based explanation might not be sufficient. Now, I think the information-based explanation where parties can't read each other's resolve or read each other's capabilities, I think that makes sense when we think about how crises escalate the conflict. Right? So, for example, Neville Chamberlain's picture might have been unable to understand how resolved Hitler was to continue his efforts to try to gain control over Europe. He might have thought Hitler might have been willing to settle for just a deal where Czechoslovakia split. Um, but but if that's not true, right, if Hitler was more committed to get the entire part of Europe, then the deal would not be sustainable. So that might explain breakdown in crises. What it doesn't necessarily explain is why wars go on for so long. If it's the case that war is a mistake, if it's the case that the parties just make a mistake, that they didn't reach each other's capability and they didn't reach each other's resolve, the fact that they actually escalate to war tells them what the resolve of the other party was and might tell them something about the capability, right? It might tell them that a country is more capable than they thought they were, or a country is more resolute than they thought they were. So, for example, once this negotiation broke down and Hitler was willing to continue his campaign in Europe, that tells you what Hitler's resolve is. What you might think then is if the problem is uncertainty about Hitler's resolve, at that point you know his resolve, so why not reach another deal? Why not strike another deal? At that point, you know each other's resolve. You should see a negotiated settlement. If the problem is uncertainty and uncertainty is ameliorated, that should settle the issue. And one thing about war is that it tends to reveal countries' capabilities. It tends to reveal countries' power, right? Because it's a public event that can't be disputed, right? So while it might be the case, for example, that Saddam Hussein, prior to the first Gulf War, promised the Vietnam in the desert and promised that Americans would be going home in large numbers in body bags, once the war started, it was fairly clear that the United States was overwhelming the Iraqi military, and that was not going to happen. Right? War just reveals that, despite these signals that are being sent by the parties involved in the conflict. So if that's the case, war should ameliorate the information problem right away, and we should see settlements. But we don't, right? Some wars go on for quite a bit of time. Now, the modal war goes on for about 3 to 4 months, so that might fit with the information-based explanation, but it doesn't explain these long conflicts like World War II. Why was it that Hitler continued to fight even after the Battle of Stalingrad, when it was clear that his military machine had been broken? Why was it that Hirohito continued to fight in the Pacific when it was clear after the Battle of Midway that his ability to defeat the United States was gone? Right? Why do we see these long conflicts go on, even when it seems like the information-based problem is taken care of? That's the question that we want to be able to understand. And to do that, we have the alternative explanation of the commitment problem. So let's define what that is first. A commitment problem exists when promises to uphold a deal, right? We can get a deal that's efficient, that's preferable to conflict, but when promises to uphold that deal are not credible, in a sense, there is no deal, right? If we strike a deal that's efficient, that's better than continuing conflict, that makes sense. But if I'm not going to uphold that deal, if I'm not going to stick to the terms of that deal, if I intend to abrogate that deal, then there in effect is no deal, right? I mean, if you imagine a situation where, suppose UNC offered you admission, right, and there's a deal in place, you agree that you're going to go to UNC, but UNC at any given moment can say, you know what, we didn't mean that, right? You're not admitted, you have to go somewhere else. In effect, then any admission to UNC, if UNC engages in that way, is not credible. So why should you take it seriously? The offer of admission from UNC, if it behaved in that way, is no deal at all, right? Similarly, if you committed to going to UNC and then you said, you know what, I changed my mind, I'm leaving, right? That's not a credible deal, right? So commitment problems exist when one or both sides cannot fulfill the terms of the deal because they can't stick to the deal. So the heart of this explanation focuses on change. Why might it be that UNC revokes your deal? Well, it might run into a financial crisis. Why might it be that you revoke your deal? Well, a better offer may come along, right? So, and that happens with athletes sometimes, that a better offer comes along, so they make a commitment, but they change it. Now, how does this relate to international politics? Well, let's take a hypothetical example. Suppose we have two states, state A and state B, and suppose they're fighting. Suppose A is winning the conflict and will be in a position to dictate terms to state B. But so in theory, at this point, the most efficient outcome would be for A to offer B a negotiated settlement that reflects the balance of power, right? A would get more in this deal than B. B should accept that because it's not likely to continue winning a conflict. It's not likely to win a conflict. So let's think dynamically, though. Suppose B is on track to develop nuclear weapons. At some point, B is going to get that weapon, right? B might then be considered on par with A in terms of its power, right? By getting the weapon, B might be able to offset some of the gains that A is making and perhaps even reverse them. But any deal that's struck today will disproportionately favor A because A is winning the war, A is winning the conflict, A looks like it's on its way to defeating B. But even if B agrees to a settlement at this point, if there is peace and B continues to develop the nuclear weapon, at some point B is not going to be able to accept a deal that disproportionately favors A. Once it gets nuclear weapons, it's going to be on par with A. And therefore, a deal that looks like this is not going to be acceptable, and B is going to be forced to engage in conflict to try to reverse, or B couldn't credibly hold to a deal like this if it has the capability to revise the deal to here. So B might try to initiate a conflict to revise the terms of the settlement. So once B gets nuclear weapons and is more powerful, it's only a matter of time before B challenges A, right? So the deal we strike today is non-credible, right? So let's think about this in terms of a concrete example. Let's think about an alternative explanation for the Gulf War of 2003. So let's look at the agreement, if we want to call it that was reached at the end of the first Gulf War, the terms of the ceasefire. Saddam was defeated. His Republican Guard units were intact. He had preserved those to maintain his internal stability, but his conventional forces were completely defeated by the United States and the coalition were forced to withdraw from Kuwait. He was also forced to accept no-fly zones over his territory, over the northern part of his territory and the southern part of his territory. I mean, he couldn't use his military completely within his own territory. And he was forced to submit to weapons inspections to ensure that he didn't develop weapons of mass destruction, right? This agreement reflected that the United States and its allies were overwhelmingly victorious and that Saddam Hussein was weaker, right? If he had to allow his country to be split, right? If he wasn't allowed to use his military in his entire country, if he had to submit to weapons inspections, and if he had to withdraw from Kuwait, he was clearly defeated and defeated decisively. But things start to change over the 1990s, right? Over the 1990s, through an effort by Saddam Hussein, right? The anti-Saddam coalition starts to fragment, right? And a push is start to be made to eventually repeal the sanctions that were weakening Saddam and keeping him in place. What we also start to see is that support for Saddam and his popularity within rival Arab states starts to grow. Simultaneously, intelligence is coming in that Saddam seems to be revamping his nuclear and chemical weapons program. And he consistently obstructs UN inspectors and eventually kicks them out entirely in 1998. So it looks like Saddam is growing in terms of his popularity, growing in terms of his military capability, and he defies the deal that was eventually in place to keep him in check. Now, why was he doing that? It's because his power was growing. It's because the deal he submitted to that was like this was now starting to shift. So given his growing power, he was more brazen in his ability and his willingness to start putting his military into the no-fly zones to challenge the coalition. And the concern was, what would happen if he got a nuclear weapon or any sort of weapon of mass destruction? Well, some people would argue nothing, right? He wouldn't do anything because fundamentally what Saddam was interested in was keeping control of his territory, and that's all. But an alternative explanation is given his behavior as the coalition start to fray, where he start to challenge the United States more and challenge the initial deal more. One argument might be once he got any sort of weapon of mass destruction, he would use this new power to start engaging in more brazen behavior, making more territorial demands, further challenging US domination over the Middle East. He would try to continue to push and push and push. And the argument is once he got nuclear weapons, he might be steadily increasing power like this. But once he gets nuclear weapons, that's a game changer, right? Suddenly his power would grow considerably, and therefore his demands and his brazenness would grow considerably. And so the argument is stop Saddam Hussein while he's like this. Stop Saddam Hussein while he's weaker. Don't wait until the moment where Saddam Hussein is equal in power, then fighting a war to try to stop Saddam Hussein is going to be very costly, very deadly. It's preferable to fight Saddam Hussein if he doesn't have nuclear weapons or chemical and biological weapons than fighting Saddam Hussein when he does. And therefore, if you think that Saddam is on track to develop these weapons, fight him now while you have the advantage. That was the argument for regime change. The only way to remove this situation, according to the Bush administration, was effectively to go all the way, right? The only way that this threat would be taken care of is if Saddam could never develop these weapons again. And the only way to do that was to remove him from power permanently, to take away any ability he would have to blackmail the United States. So long as he was there, so long as he was developing these weapons, it was only a matter of time before he would get them. And once he gets them, he may be uncontrollable. And so the argument there was because he is likely to get them, because he's pursuing them, the US would need to strike preemptively. Now think about that. What that's saying is that there's no deal, right? There is a deal perhaps that would be ex post efficient where Saddam would agree, I won't pursue weapons of mass destruction. And the United States would say, okay, we'll leave you alone if you don't. But because that agreement is not credible, right, because Saddam's ability to get these weapons is going, and because some point he will, we can't get a deal. The deal becomes unstable. So that is an argument, not just for war against Iraq, but for preemption just generally, right? That you can't wait for threats to materialize, that they're going to materialize, and it's better to deal with them while you're in a position of power than to wait until you're in a position of parity. That exact same argument has been made about Iran, right? The argument has been over and over again that if the United States is going to go to war with Iran, it shouldn't wait until Iran has weapons of mass destruction. It should do it prior to that, right? And if the United States is going to go to war with North Korea, it shouldn't wait till North Korea has the ability to deliver a nuclear weapon to the west coast of the United States. It should do it before that. That is the argument for preemptive war. It is not the same thing as the information-based explanation. The information-based explanation was that the sides would get to war because they would make a mistake. Here, there's no mistake. Here, it's a conscious decision to try to attack in order to deal with this problem of change, in order to deal with the idea that a power is growing more powerful relative to you, and at that point, they'll be able to change the status quo in their favor. So you fight now. Now, I would tell you to take a moment, pause this if you will, and think about this. Would you be willing to go to war in order to stop these future threats, right? Is that reasonable? Given the cost of war, given the danger of war, would you be willing to initiate a conflict? Would you be willing to initiate a conflict to fight in order to prevent another country from getting more powerful than you, right? That's a big risk. That's a big gamble to take, right? So you have to think about that, right? And that's in a lot of ways a moral choice too. Are you willing to fight in order to prevent the possibility that another country gets more powerful and can threaten you into the future? So stop and think about that. But let's go on and think about some other parts of this. Suppose you do make the choice to fight, right? Suppose the United States destroys North Korea before it gets nuclear weapons, or destroys Iran before it gets nuclear weapons, assuming that it could. Then what? What happens then, right? Again, the commitment problem stops with this idea that war is initiated and that's the end of it, but that's typically not the end of it. Once war is initiated, there's a long process to actually prosecuting the war, consolidating the gains, replacing the regime if that's what you want to do, and try to cement what's in control of that territory, all of which is very, very difficult. Right now, consider the counterfactual. We know that going that far is going to be difficult. Let's consider the counterfactual. Suppose Saddam Hussein gets these weapons. How much does this change the strategic situation? How much more powerful is he? And is this worth the risk and the cost of conflict? Is it worth going this far and doing all of this? Right, so let me pause there and then we'll come back with a video on other types of commitment problems, which are wars over sources of power and wars over the cost of maintaining peace.